Welcome back, hosers. We're going to try something new today. I really like videos where I'm actually doing something instead of standing around flapping my face holes, but it's kind of hard to do that. Maybe I'll get better with practice, but for today, I'm going to play footage of me building raised beds while I jam out to talking heads in my earbuds, and my future self is going to talk about raised beds generally. That's me. I'm my future self. It's not as confusing as it sounds. I remember the analysis paralysis I had to deal with when I first set out to build my raised beds. I wanted something that would last for the rest of my life, but I couldn't afford it. I still can't really, but I've kind of changed my priorities when it comes to raised beds. Now I choose to plan for obsolescence and go with a design that's really easy to repair, so I don't need to stress as much about the durability of my materials. You can see that the corners of my raised beds are concrete fixed in place by rebar. That's the permanent part. Then I cut some 2x Douglas fir to size and slide it into the concrete corner pieces. Using 2x material is going to be more durable than 1x material, and Douglas fir is more resinous and thus more long-lasting than common pine. But it's still about a third as expensive as comparably sized redwood or cedar or juniper would be. I should get about a decade from this wood before I need to replace it. If you live in a wetter environment, you may not get to keep your Douglas fir as long as I do. If you have a grown-up sized budget instead of a casual gardener sized budget, go ahead and buy yourself some nice cedar wood for your raised beds. You deserve it. Treat yourself. But it's not necessary. It's a treat. Something I think we all need to remember when we're being neurotic about building our raised beds is that beyond a single growing season, most of the plants we put in there just aren't going to care. If your carrots care about whether your raised bed lasts into the following year, you probably forgot to harvest them. Most of what we plant in a vegetable garden isn't going to last more than a single growing season. So anything we make our raised bed out of that's stronger than a pile of dirt is basically for our benefit, not for our plants. And that means that if you're stressing about your raised beds, you're probably doing it wrong. You can make your raised bed out of rocks, with or without mortar to hold them in place. You can make it out of bricks. You can make it out of logs or wattle. You can make it out of pine or fir or cedar. Or I guess you could even use furniture grade lumber like walnut or cherry if you really need to flex. Your raised bed can be nailed or screwed together, or not. It's all up to you. I think corrugated steel raised beds are kind of in fashion right now. If you can afford it and it's what makes you happy, go for it. One question I've been asked is, doesn't the metal make the beds get too hot in the summer? No, it doesn't. Wood is a better insulator than metal is, but being a poor insulator doesn't mean the metal will make your bed hotter. In fact, it feels hotter because it's not as good at holding on to the heat it absorbs. So it's giving that heat to you when you touch it. In a raised bed that's filled with whatever you fill your beds with, there's going to be so much thermal mass to absorb and disperse heat that it honestly won't make a difference if your bed is made of metal. At least it won't make a difference to your plants. There are some benefits to your plants from gardening in a raised bed that are independent of what you have chosen to make your bed out of. But we should remember that gardening is complex. It's not a set of rules to follow. Gardening is how we work with the environment we're in to grow food or flowers. And that means that any benefit in one situation can become detrimental in another one. Raised beds will warm up sooner in the spring, which means you may be able to start some crops a little sooner in a raised bed than you would be able to if you were growing in the ground. But the flip side is that they'll cool off a little faster in the fall, and might shorten your fall growing season in some situations. It's a trade-off. Raised beds will have better drainage. I built raised beds in my current garden because we have clay soil here in Logan, Utah, and drainage is kind of an issue in clay soil. But the flip side is that if you have sandy soil or live in a particularly arid part of the world, you won't be doing your plants any favors by putting them in a raised bed. Improving drainage in sandy soil sounds like an invitation to a bad season of gardening. If you have soil that drains a little too well, or you live somewhere like Death Valley, Arizona, you might even consider the opposite of raised beds. There is an opposite: sunken beds. Sunken beds trap cool air, so they stay cool longer, and they're more likely to hold on to what little rain you get because they're going to be the low spot in your garden. Sunken beds go way back in North America. The Anasazi used a sort of sunken bed for gardening that some people call a waffle bed. The Anasazi probably didn't call them waffle beds because I'm pretty sure they hadn't invented waffles. There are some human benefits of raised beds that I am quite fond of. That's why I had them in my last garden as well, even though I had sandy loam soil in my last garden and they weren't strictly necessary. I really enjoy the way that raised beds help define a garden space. There isn't anything magical about raised beds that reduces soil compaction. It's just more work to step in them. Most critters that are big enough to compact your soil would probably rather just walk around your raised bed. I also really like that raised beds can help reduce weeding. There's no magic there either. It's just that having rigidly defined pathways and keeping my lawn a couple of feet away from the bed makes it easier to head off weeds before they make it into my beds. Perhaps most importantly, it's nice to have something to sit on when I'm planting, weeding, or harvesting. And I suspect it's just going to get more important as I get older and more out of shape. The perfect height for a raised bed is whatever height you need it to be. Beyond the first 6 to 8 inches of extra height, if your raised beds are bottomless, the height of your bed is about what looks or feels right to you. You will need a minimum of 12 inches of soil depth for many crops, and I prefer at least 18 inches for tomatoes. So if your raised beds are on a concrete surface or built onto a deck like oversized planters, you might want to take that into account. In the case of beds with built-in bottoms, you'll also see reduced water retention with reduced depth, and that can contribute to blossom end rot or tomatoes, or at best, having to water your bed more often. So if your raised bed is open at the bottom, the only guidance for height that's really important is your budget. I go 12 inches tall right now because it's just cheaper to buy one 2x12 or two 2x6s than it is to buy twice as many. And also, having filled a few raised beds, it's become more important to me that twice the height is going to take twice as much shoveling to fill. I feel like gardening in raised beds and having defined gardening spaces and pathways makes it easier for me to plan and build automated irrigation systems. Some of us love manually watering our gardens, and, well, some of us just don't. I've found that my garden does better if the watering is automated, and that goes doubly so for any planters on my patio. What I hope I'm communicating to you with this video is that there isn't a best way to build your raised bed. Mounding your soil up without any support at all is still technically a raised bed and will give you most of the benefits of a more built raised bed. It's okay if someone whose sense of status includes what you've made your raised beds out of. Go ahead and make your raised beds out of the most expensive stuff you can. I'm looking forward to oohing and awing at your solid jade, gold-trimmed raised beds with laser deer deterrents and marble pathways. You can have that if you need it, but it's not necessary. You don't need to build anything at all. A pile of dirt is a raised bed. Personally, I like that there's so much variety in raised beds out there. I really love seeing all the different ways raised beds can be done. I'd be happiest if everyone figured out raised beds for themselves, and then, I don't know, we could have the slowest parade ever, because raised beds don't move. Unless yours does. Okay, I have an email address for this channel. Please email me a picture of your mobile raised beds if you have them. That sounds amazing. If you're doing raised beds for the first time, one thing you should probably know is that whatever you fill it with, it'll be about 2 or 3 inches lower next year. And whatever you top it up with, it'll be 2 or 3 inches lower the year after that. Unless you topped it up with rocks or concrete. Please don't try to grow stuff in rocks or concrete. My personal theory about this soil subsidence that happens is that we're usually including more organic material when we fill our raised beds, and that stuff will tend to decompose over time. Since we're watering our beds regularly, that's probably going to accelerate decomposition. It's okay for your raised beds to sink over time. It's perfectly normal. It probably means you have healthy soil and wormy goodness happening in there. You just need to plan for that soil subsidence to be a regular part of your life. For instance, I've decided I'm not going to do strawberries in raised beds anymore, just because it was a lot of work trying not to bury their crowns when I topped my raised beds off with compost. There's not a rule about this because I don't want you to feel like gardening has rules, but I'm just going to say that it's not necessary to till your raised beds. The natural movement from planting and harvesting and weeding and soil critters is going to work in whatever you add. So when I add compost to my raised beds, I just lay it on top and plant into it. The compost can act as a mulch and help suppress weeds in your garden until it's been worked in by your regular gardening routine and the critters in your soil. I'm not telling you you should never till your raised beds. I'm just saying you probably don't need to spend that effort. You may even wind up with healthier soil if you skip tilling. How cool is that? Laziness with benefits. The practice of not tilling our gardens is commonly referred to as no-till gardening or no-dig gardening. I want to make it very clear that that's not what I'm doing, because I disrupt the soil a lot when I use it to fill raised beds. My garden is not Charles Dowding approved, but I do incorporate a lot of the basic ideas behind no-till gardening because there is a lot about it that works after the initial chaos and upheaval of filling a raised bed. I believe that there are a lot of contradicting but equally good ideas out there when it comes to gardening. Our job is not to find a set of ideas and adhere dogmatically to them. Just as the majestic bumblebee goes from flower to flower, taking what it needs, we should take what we need from each gardening system in order to succeed as gardeners. Thank you for joining me in my garden today, and I hope you have a wonderful time in yours.